If you're watching online later, we're thankful that you're here. We are going to obviously talk a little bit about our history as a Methodist Church. So that's going to break down into this. This week, we're going to talk about the history. We'll learn a little bit more about that and my take on that here in a couple minutes. The theology will be next week. The polity, which means our governance, is going to be the third week and how all that operates. In the fourth week will be Pastor Craig will be here. I'm going to be gone, but Pastor Craig will be here. So the Q&A session, we're going to make the deacon handle, but for me, this will just be mostly lecture and discussion. And so Pastor Craig will be here, and he's going to talk about the state of Methodism today, current events, what's happening in the world today. Take your questions about things that you've heard or things that you want to know. That can be anything from Methodist Church globally to what's happening locally within the Methodist denomination in the Missouri Conference or whatever, or simply something that you've learned that you want to dive into more that hopefully he'll be able to answer those questions for you. So that's what we'll cover over the course of this. And the reason that we're doing this is because we've recently gotten some questions and desires to do a deeper dive into some of this stuff. And questions about our what it means to be Methodist and what we believe and the roots of our tradition, to understand some of the history and theology and how it all operates. Obviously, too, recently we've kind of gotten there's some drama happening in our church, which I think we probably know, but there's drama happening in every church. It doesn't matter what brand they put on it or what logo they hold or what their theology is. It's just when you get that many people involved, there's going to be drama. And so that's just what we're experiencing right now. And so some of this stuff has just led to questions about our church and about our denomination, even things like Pastor Craig's presence where he's ordained, but he's ordained a deacon. I've gotten questions of, well, what does that mean? And how's that different from what you do, Pastor Sean? And when we do charge conference, what is that? And what is the district that we say we're part of and conference? And how does all of this stuff work? And how does all of it connect down to theology of things like, well, why do we baptize babies? And things like that you can possibly imagine. To people who are from a different faith background can come into the Methodist faith and kind of be like, well, why do we do all this Catholic stuff, right? And so we're going to kind of talk about some of the history of that may help you understand some of this stuff. But for me, most of you probably know this. I'm as Methodist as they come. My dad is a pastor in the Methodist Church, first career, always has been. That's all that I know. And my mom was born and raised Methodist herself. And so that's how my dad came to be. And so the Methodist Church is really all that I've known. But then I got married, and my wife, Brittany, started working at an organization in St. Louis called Epworth, which worked with foster kids and their families. And that was started by the United Methodist Women. And now we've moved out to Central Missouri, and my wife has taken one step closer to me by working at the annual conference for the Methodist Church in Columbia. And so we're about as Methodist as they come. But that's not a good enough reason, right, to keep doing things the way you're doing it. Our heritage, how we're brought up, and our experiences are not a good enough reason to keep doing what we do, right? It's not a good enough reason to keep behaving the way that we behave. And so for me, it's a true examination of me to really say, after my studies, in my learning, this is what I believe in. I believe the Wesleyan tradition, Methodism is rooted in the Wesleyan tradition. This is about the closest to biblical accuracy of theology that I can understand. And that being said, there are plenty of things that we'll talk about that are probably incorrect, or at least from God's perspective, incomplete. And I say that all the time because I'm not perfect in this stuff. We're all on this journey of doing the best that we can to understand something that we will never understand. If we could understand it, there'd be a problem because that would make God a lot smaller than God ought to be. And so that's a little bit of my history. And so kind of what I thought we'd do is take a minute, talk to each other about, in just literally 2 minutes, because we're going to get to talking about our history. But talk about your history with the Methodist Church. What do you think you know? Can you give yourself a rating on a scale of 1 to 10? How much do I know? Am I starting on ground zero here? Or do I feel like I have some understanding of our history and theology? Just have a discussion of how you've landed where you landed. And why you want to know more. So take a couple minutes and chat amongst yourselves. 2, 3, however many people you want to talk to. Do the whole table if you want, whatever. I alluded to this before, maybe some of you were even in the room. I'm not a big history guy. I really think some of this stuff is Snoresville. When I was in seminary, we had options for different classes to take. We had to take Church History 1, which led up to the mid-centuries, and then we had to take Church History 2, which was mid-centuries to modern day. And we had what we called J-term courses, which meant you just took them for a week-long intensive in January. So you had readings to do before, work to do after, but all of your lectures were crammed into a 9 to 5 for 5 days, Monday through Friday. And I took my church history classes in the J-term format, which seems crazy if you don't like history, but 1 week was way better than 3.5 months to me. So that's why I decided to do that. This stuff interests me a lot more than like the Byzantine Empire does. Like, as interesting as that is, this feels like heritage to me, if that makes sense. This feels like my own roots based on where I find myself, and so I do find it a little bit more interesting, and I also think the way that it's presented makes a big difference too. And so we're going to start with history. And so if we start with history of the Methodist Church, where do you think we're going to start? We're going to start at the birth of John Wesley, which happened in 1703. John Wesley was born to Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Samuel was an Anglican priest, and Susanna was a progressive female dissenter. John got a lot of his tutelage, I think both biological and sociological, his way of being from his mom, Susanna. Sam was stodgy and strict. He was not a ton of fun. He was, his churches, on multiple occasions, his churches burned down his house because of how upset they were with him. They moved over to the Anglican Church from the Puritan Church. You might also be familiar with the Anglican Church, referred to as sort of the Church of England, as part of the same family. They moved over from the Puritan Church, and if you know about the Puritans, what is the root word of Puritan? Pure, which is a lot to do with piety, and that works of piety and things of that nature. Heavy into works, heavy into doing things the right way and order and strictness and fundamentalism, and they move over to the Anglican Church. But some of that strictness and buttoned up nature that's still present in the Anglican Church, especially in the 18th century. But some of that carries over for Samuel. And at one point, Samuel and his wife Susanna get into a disagreement. He leaves the house, and they're living separated for a brief period of time. And once that happened, Susanna not only took over the household, but she took over his parish as well. She took over his parish at a time where she was not allowed to do that. So when we say she's a progressive dissenter, this is what we mean. Not only did she take over the parish, but the church exploded once she did. And you can imagine how that made Samuel feel when he's had all the struggles that he's had. He gets in a disagreement with his wife, and she takes over the church, and it just starts to explode with growth. Susanna, I don't know that she ever slept. She was busy, busy, busy. I know we all love our moms, but she taught John Wesley more than your mom taught you, I promise you. She taught him Greek, she taught him Hebrew, she taught him Latin. Some of the things were just normal for the day, but she also went above and beyond. She had a weekly check-in with all of her children. She had 19 of them. 9 of them died in infancy, but they would have weekly check-ins about their spiritual formation and their spiritual health. This was the fun parent that's doing all this. And Susanna was really the most formative person in John Wesley's life was his mom. So imagine that. And Susanna herself was the 25th of 25 children. And so part of that is just the way the world was at the time. But you can see how that might have changed John and informed John's life to become who he ended up becoming. They would have lived here. This is called the Epworth Rectory. So I mentioned a minute ago, my wife worked for an organization called Epworth in St. Louis, started by the United Methodist Women, is named after this place. Now, a rectory would have been a parsonage, the same thing as we think of as a parsonage, the place where the pastor lived. They lived here. This is in London, and it's still there. You can kind of tell. We'll talk about why there's differences between the two in a minute. Obviously, it's kept up to date, but it's the same structure as the original once it was rebuilt, which we'll get to that in just a second. If you were with us on Sunday, you heard me talk about how the Wesley family believed that their house was haunted by a ghost. His name was Old Jeffrey. That's where Old Jeffrey would have lived with the Wesleys, is inside of that house. I mentioned it's still there today, but the original one on the left, you can see, that one was the first Epworth that was built. But it caught fire, and everybody got out of the house except for John. John is stuck inside the house, and a couple of parishioners managed to rescue John from the house. And from then on, John referred to himself as a brand plucked from the fire. Now, as a pastor, you have to be very careful when you say that phrase and make sure you don't get some letters mixed up or it could be ugly for you. But this was a way that he referred to sort of God's intervention for his life, a moment where it could have ended for John. Think about your house and getting the people out of it and the things that you want out of it when a fire is going on. Now imagine if there's 10 kids living there. I mean, you're having to take attendance every half second to make sure everybody's out. And so John luckily gets out, and the parishioners in the church work to rebuild Epworth, and they do rebuild it, and that's the structure you see on the right. Obviously, it's been updated and well taken care of over the years, but it is the same structure that still exists today. After his growing up, which I gave you some background as far as what it would have been like for him with Susanna sort of really truly leading the way, and what that looked like. I'll go back to a brief story of Susanna. John Wesley wrote about times when Susanna, the way that she would get quiet time with 10 kids to be able to pray, would be she would put a cloth over her head. And when she put a cloth over her head, that was the signal to her kids that says, "Leave me alone, don't talk to me." And she was in prayer when this time would happen. And so you can imagine how difficult with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 kids, how getting quiet time and alone time would be difficult. But with 10, would be hard. And that's just one example of Susanna's devoutness, that in the midst of all that, in the midst of all of her teaching, she's not just a teacher, she had her own personal faith life that was really formative for John Wesley as well. And so after that childhood is over, he goes on to study at Christ Church in Oxford. Obviously, at Oxford, this is one of the more prestigious universities in England, and certainly one of the most prestigious in the world. After finishing that, he got his master's degree from the same place at Oxford, and he got a fellowship there as well, became a fellow and began to teach. He taught New Testament, and he taught Greek, and he taught philosophy. And coming from sort of this hybrid, puritanical and Anglican upbringing and being so intelligent, Wesley believed that it would be strict adherence to the law that would create this faithfulness, that would create salvation. Obedience to the law is what brings about salvation for the Puritans, and he had much of that upbringing within him. And yet at the same time, you can see the dynamic relationship between having sort of a progressive dissenting mother paired with this puritanical upbringing. And that's, I think, what am I looking for? That heritage, I think, lives on today in the way that the Methodist Church has strong theology, rooted in doctrine, but at the same time has a really strong social justice bend, has a strong bend towards serving the world around you, and a good understanding of salvation theology, which we'll talk about in a minute. At Oxford, I think I have this on a future slide, but at Oxford he was a part of a club called the Holy Club. They did not call themselves that. They were named the Holy Club, and so you can imagine just how much fun that they were to be around. The Holy Club, they would study together, they would pray together, they would have communion together on Sundays. They visited prisons, they visited orphanages, they visited the sick. They were a group of people, along with John Wesley's brother Charles, who you might know from writing hymns and things of that nature. They were devoted to this holy club. In their own way, they were an original small group almost, and it grew and grew and grew and grew. And this became part of what we'll see later on between the history and sort of probably some here and then some in the polity course as well, that this sort of has some hangings on and influence on Wesley and how he organized his ministry and how he organized the church. And so he didn't end up being a fellow and a teacher at Oxford for long, because his old home came calling, and he moved back to Epworth, and he started serving at church. He started serving a church there. Not long after that, there you can see he was ordained a priest in the Church of England in 1728. And I think this is evidence that Wesley, although extremely intelligent, extremely bright, very academic, was rooted in his love of the church and rooted in his love of the people more than just the academic side of things. That he didn't stay a teacher long. He almost used it to be able to grow his education so that he could end up back in the field, if you will. Let's see where we are. All right, there we go. So he's serving, living in his old home around the area, serving a couple different parishes in the Church of England in the late 1720s there. We mentioned the Holy Club earlier. So now while he's serving these two churches, a British parliamentarian who was charged with establishing the English claim to the colony of Georgia, his name was James Oglethorpe, asked John to go with him as a missionary to the state of Georgia. John was nervous about doing this. One thing that you can learn about John Wesley pretty quickly, he was absolutely horrified of dying, terrified. There's a natural anxiety around death that we have as humans, right? That's normal. But I think based on his writings and the history that we have of it, a psychologist would say that it went beyond the normal anxiety that surrounds death for John. Absolutely terrified of it. And so you can imagine what it would be like in the early to mid 18th century to go to this place you've never seen before in this boat crossing the Atlantic Ocean. He's terrified of it. And so he goes to his mom, Susanna, his mentor in this faith, and says, "What do I do?" And Susanna says, "I wish I would have 20 sons that would be willing to do this for the Lord." And so that inspired John to go ahead and say yes to Oglethorpe's offer to help him. And along the way, he ran into some people who were Moravian settlers from Georgia. We'll talk about going to Georgia from Germany, and we'll learn more about them in a minute. So he goes with Oglethorpe and the English parliamentarians to help settle this place in Georgia. He becomes one of the founders of the city of Savannah, Georgia, and he also helps establish church there. He also begins the roots of what we would know as Methodism that wasn't quite established there. He would have been doing so more from an Anglican perspective. John Wesley, has a similar experience in Savannah that Samuel Wesley had in a lot of churches in England. They were not ready for his type of teaching, for his expectations, for his intensity of what they required. And so the people in Savannah, the churches in Savannah, chased John Wesley out of town. And so it's not very successful for John. This seems odd to us, right? We think John Wesley, he's one of the greatest theologians that we know, one of the greatest church leaders that we know. It didn't go well for him in Savannah. And I think we can trace this to the roots of his puritanical upbringing of being too strict and too rough. And he's dealing with people who probably don't have a lot of church upbringing. Can you imagine that? And then expecting them to make a leap from not a disciple at all to complete adherence to the way that Wesley thought we were supposed to do ministry. And so that rubbed people the wrong way. And so because he fails I wouldn't say fails, because he has a rough go of it in Savannah, he heads back home. To England, really feeling like that didn't go well, and so he goes back to a safe space. All right, let's say here. So when we talk about the expectations that Wesley had, I'm going to show you a little bit of what I'm talking about by looking at a day in the life of Wesley from John Wesley's journal. Now keep in mind, what I'm about to show you is John Wesley's written journal from when he was at the age of 85. This is his life at the age of 85. Are you ready? At 4 a.m., he would wake up. He would pray and read until 6 a.m. He would journal from 6 to 8. From 8 to 9:30, he would have tea and conversation with whoever he found himself around, because he would bounce around to preach. Probably you would find this with at this age, at 85, he was certainly a little bit more nomadic than he would have been early on, because he's finding all sorts of speaking engagements and places to meet people. So tea and conversation until 9:30. At 9:30, he would preach, and then he would leave for the next place. At 1:30 p.m., he would preach again. Sometimes this is field preaching. Sometimes this was in churches. Probably at this phase, at 85, it would have been more in early Methodist churches. At At 5 p.m., he would come back home. He would preach one more time. At 7 p.m., he would have a society meeting, which would have been like a small group for them at 7 p.m., and he would have dinner and prayer time, and he'd be in bed by 9. And then he'd do the next thing the next day. 85 years old. Can you imagine the motor? So when this guy is expecting some, maybe not everybody preaches, but we're expecting something like this among people who've not practiced anything ever before, you can see how they might have rebelled to that. So Wesley was serious. And actually, this gives you a picture of what might make sense as a little bit of a struggle for Wesley. And that struggle is that he's active in his faith and he's doing all these things, not necessarily at 85, because the experience we're going to tell you about in a minute happened when he was much younger. But this type of lifestyle is still happening at a younger age. And he's dissatisfied with what he's doing. Because, and this is my take on this, I think Wesley didn't understand really how simple grace was. Because of his puritanical upbringing, the strictness of that, and his desire to teach, his desire to learn, his desire to preach, really made him feel like there was something here to earn. There was something here that I had to do to get something in return from God. Right? So he's dissatisfied with all this stuff. He's wildly successful planting groups and societies, which we'll get into a little more in a minute. He's very active himself in his faith, but still not feeling like he was where he should be. Now, remember how I talked about his fear of death? A lot of this relates to his fear of death, because what Wesley says is, if I believe in salvation, if I believe in everlasting life, if I believe in life after death, why am I still so terrified of death? Can you see that line of thinking? If this is what I stand for, if this is what I believe Jesus brings me upon salvation for this life and the life to come, why am I so gripped by fear of death? And he feels like there's something that he needs to have. He asks for three things. He wants assurance of deliverance of sin, he wants joy, and he wants to basically eliminate some of his fear of death. These are the things that he's seeking, that he says, if I really believe this stuff, why don't I have those things? Okay? And so what happened when Wesley, remember I mentioned a people called the Moravians a minute ago. They're Germanic Christian people who influenced Wesley greatly, because on that trip to Savannah, Georgia, he's on a boat with the Moravians who are going to America to do the same thing that Wesley is doing as Christian missionaries. And the boat is rocked to the point of they are afraid that they're going to die, with massive storm and waves and things that you can possibly imagine. And Wesley is amazed at what he sees in the Moravians. They are singing hymns. They are reading scripture. They are talking, and not in a way of like, let's read our scriptures and say our Lord's Prayer so it's the last thing we do before we die. But they are singing God's praises in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the chaos, and he cannot fathom how they are not absolutely terrified. To remind you of a biblical story. Right? When Jesus calms the storm, the disciples are freaking out because they're going to die on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus is doing what? Taking a nap. So the Moravians are the Jesus character in the story for Wesley. In the midst of the chaos are calm and are praising God, and Wesley is freaking out about how he's going to die. And this sticks with Wesley his whole time in Savannah and his time back. And he meets a guy when he returns back to England who's a Moravian himself, and his name is Peter Böhler. And Peter Böhler becomes a huge inspiration and mentor for Wesley. Peter Böhler influenced Wesley in a variety of ways, and he was the person that Wesley really turned to, saying, I met some Moravians on this ship, but I need you to tell me what y'all have that I don't. Right? How we looking?
67.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. So he says to the Moravians, I want to know what you have, Peter Böhler, and what they have that I don't, because I want it. And they begin this relationship. And Wesley is confused about how he can continue to live this life of disjointedness in his faith and yet continue to preach. And you can see what's on the screen is what Peter Böhler told him. Preach faith until you have it, and then you'll preach faith because you have it. Bowler told Wesley that he can have this faith that he desires. It's a gift from the Holy Spirit. It's not anything that Peter Bowler's done that's magical. He says this is a gift from God. So I mentioned this a minute ago. You can kind of see, I think Wesley worked himself into a tizzy that he could not fathom, that he could not attain salvation on his own, that he could not work God into loving him, that he cannot do these things into being forgiven. He cannot do these things to earn forgiveness from the past. But through Bowler, his eyes were opened to the idea that it really is more simple than I make it out to be. And on May 24th, 1738, Wesley goes unwillingly to a Moravian society meeting where they would preach. It's Moravian church, okay? He goes to a Moravian church meeting on Aldersgate Street in London. He goes more out of responsibility than an actual desire to be there. It's famous because Wesley talks about how he didn't want to be there, and yet it was at this moment that he had this most significantly impactful moment in his faith on Aldersgate Street. He heard Luther's writings about the book of Romans, and Wesley felt his heart strangely warmed, famously said. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. And he says this, "I felt I did trust Christ alone for salvation, and assurance was given to me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." You see how easy that is, right? It's simple when he lays it out about this experience he's had. I felt I did trust Christ alone for salvation, and assurance was given to me. And so this day is a Methodist holiday, May 24th. We refer to it as Aldersgate Day, because it's to this day, truly, that we can point our existence to. Without it, we're probably never born. Without this conversion experience, the Methodist Church is probably never born. Aldersgate Street, and we can thank the Moravians for that as well. And so in 1739, Wesley breaks away from the Moravians and forms his own societies. These are theological differences. The Moravians would have been closer to Lutheranism, and Wesley wants to break out on his own and forms his own societies. Now, Wesley wasn't intending to start this church, right? He's not intending to start the Methodist Church. He's not intending to start the Wesleyan Church. He's basically trying to create more holy clubs. Remember that? He's just trying to help people live out their faith and learn and grow a little bit more. But Wesley was not welcomed in some of the churches to create this movement. So he's partnering with Anglican churches to be able to speak to people and to help them along in their discipleship, forming these societies. Now, Wesley wasn't invited to some of these churches because he was too radical. He was too radical in his bent toward social justice. He was too radical in his bent toward how we treat people of other races and slaves. He was too radical in some of the things that he thought about socially and politically. And so they kicked him out of the church because he was shaken up too much. And so what Wesley did is he started preaching in the fields. He didn't want to, but Wesley decided to preach in the fields. There's even a famous moment where he preaches on top. He stands on top of his dad's grave in a churchyard. It's an elevated grave, and he stands on top of it because it's his family's property. The church cannot legally kick him out of it, and so he stands on it as a pulpit to basically be as close to the church as possible to capture those people in this Wesleyan movement. But he field preaches. He preaches on every corner he can possibly preach in. He goes out into the world, brings this message to the people, and the movement begins to grow and begins to grow and begins to grow. And these people, these societies that he's forming, begin to be called Methodists because they are so methodical in the way that they do ministry. This was not a name that they gave themselves, but it was sort of a name of derision given to them, almost teasing them for how they did ministry. And yet it began to stick over time. And these societies grew, and these groups grew to the point where they needed organized places for worship to continue doing what they were doing because they were getting too large. And so they began to meet in this place called the New Room, which wasn't originally a church. I couldn't tell you what the original purpose of this building was, but they took it over. It's still there today. You can visit it. This is obviously a modern day picture of the same place. In terms of the specific aspects of that room that are the same or different, I don't know. I can tell you, do you see the line in the middle of the pews? Does anybody know why that's there?
Separate the men and women.
That's right. The men sat on one side and the women sat on the other. So that's the way that they would have done that. In church at the time, didn't matter if you were married, didn't matter what your situation was, you sat on opposite sides. Where do you think the kids sat?
With the women.
That's right, with the women. That's right. They sat with the women, you're right. And so now, like I say, whether the woodwork there is actually original and things like that, I can't tell you. But if it's not original, I've never been there. It's not original. I'll be there someday, but I've not been there yet. Then it's made to look exactly how it was. It's been restored its glory. As you can see kind of in the back of the room, it doesn't operate as a church today. It's really more of a museum to Wesley and to Methodism. But you can certainly still visit that. So they would have public learning times, and then they would go back into what was called their classes or their bands. So the worship service wasn't the meat like it is today. The meat was their classes and bands, which were just the most intense small groups you can possibly imagine, where they would confess their sins to one another and share their struggles. They were broken up by genders, like we might think of small groups today, where you have men that pray together and talk together that are in similar life situations. And so they would confess their sins, they would apply what they learned, and to support one another in life. They would ask themselves pretty intense questions that they would go over on a weekly, at least weekly, if not more often, basis. But the New Room became not enough for the Methodist movement, and so they moved into this place called the Foundry. And the Foundry was actually originally made, was a brass factory where they made cannons for the British military. And it became abandoned because essentially it blew up and caught on fire, and the Methodists took the opportunity to move into that and to fix the building up, and it became a new home for them. And so more roots of modern day Methodism, you may be familiar that I think the Methodists can be some of the more creative churches in terms of how we don't limit ourselves to church buildings, but we're doing creative things like having dinner churches at places in our community, and we take things out into the community. We have churches even here in Missouri that have, at least the one that I'm aware of, I think we have more, but the one that I'm aware of that's new was founded out of a bar in O'Fallon, and now they've moved to a new facility because they've grown to where that's not going to work for them anymore. But that's rooted in Wesley's movement. Wesley preached where early on? In the fields, right? It's not a come to me movement. It's the gospel goes to us. God's grace comes to us. Well, hey there, this is different. We had some technical difficulties while we were recording this live, and so I just wanted to come back and do a final recording in the last sort of few minutes to bring us up to speed with our lesson on the history of the United Methodist Church, where we left off talking about how the movement had just moved into the Foundry and how this was an example of the Methodist churches and really the Wesleyan movement's commitment to taking the message and taking the movement to the people and not necessarily creating an institution that people would come to, and how the roots of that still exist heavily in the church today and the influence that we have. And so they move into the Foundry, but then the Foundry becomes a less than hospitable place for them to stay. And so they move to City Road Chapel, also known as Wesley's Chapel. This obviously still remains in London. The picture is here. It's still there today, and it's actually an operating church. There are several hundred people that visit it on most Sundays, and there's also a museum there for Wesley and the Methodist movement. And Wesley's grave is also at the site at City Road Chapel. So the Methodists moved to City Road Chapel, but again, just to reiterate, I think that Wesley and the people involved in it would say that these larger gathering spaces were just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the Methodist movement was. But as they continued to grow, they needed more space to be able to do so. And as they continued to grow, they needed more organization. They needed more administration. As you can imagine, Wesley and his brother, John Wesley and his brother Charles, were needing some sort of organization to really to really guide this movement, so that way as it grew to new counties and new places, even globally, that they had some founding documents that says this is what we stand for, this is what we believe, and this is how we operate and how we're organized. And so in 1743, they drew up the general rules in order to accomplish that. And the general rules is really the first movement from sort of grassroots faith movement to denomination. You see that, how we now have founding documents and some sort of doctrine in 1743. And these general rules are still part of the foundation of our United Methodist doctrine today. And so as the number of church communities continued to increase, the administration that was necessary to take care of that, to guide these churches, to help these churches, to check in on them and make sure that their theology is proper, that their leaders are leading in the way that they thought appropriate. They needed even further administration, and so John and his brother Charles and a few other clergy and a bunch of laity became the first ruling body of the Methodist movement, and that happened around 1744. So now they have this guiding document of the general rules, and now this guiding sort of board, if you will, that oversaw the Methodist movement. And so now this movement grows and grows and grows to the point where we're seeing it around the world. Obviously, you've heard stories of it being brought into the United States. And in American Methodism, the color barrier was broken before the American Methodist Church really even started. Both John and Charles were vehemently opposed to slavery, and so you can imagine when we talk about how John didn't have much success in Savannah, sometimes it was based on social principles like that. The people weren't super receptive to the idea that slavery is anti-biblical in the 18th century in the South in the United States. But this is part of what makes this movement great and part of what makes this movement so successful. John Wesley baptized 2 African-American slaves in 1758. So before the Methodist Church in America was even founded, the color barrier was broken. So from the very beginning, we have inclusion of the races when Wesley baptizes 2 African-American slaves in 1758. In the 1760s, we start to see Methodist colonists arrive in America. So that led to, in 1776, the first Methodist church in America is established. That's in Philadelphia. And the second is in New York shortly thereafter. We brought a couple pictures of them. I think the New York building is not original, and I believe the Philadelphia one is original. Both are on the same spot, if they're not actually original buildings. So this movement begins to grow, but Methodism in America still isn't taking off, we wouldn't say. It's successful in that it exists and it's being governed and it's being operated, but it's not growing to the length as we've seen in the movement in England. And it wasn't until a guy by the name of Francis Asbury arrived in America that the church really began to explode. In 1784, John Wesley ordains Asbury and Thomas Coke as superintendents in the United States. So these are the people who are overseeing the Methodist churches in the U.S. And they are administrative geniuses on top of their commitment to this movement and to being with the people of it. And it's because of that administrative genius that the church in America began to explode because of their leadership. And this happened at a conference that marks the true official founding of the Methodist Episcopal Church in America. That was in 1784. And soon after came the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And eventually the African Methodist Episcopal Church made up 20% of all American Methodists. And obviously we're aware that the AME Church still survives to this day as part of our Methodist tradition and our Methodist heritage as well. But 20% of Methodists in America were African Methodist Episcopal church members. And so Francis Asbury is leading and overseeing a lot of this work. And he also establishes the General Conference to which delegates were sent as part of the larger governing body. So basically saying, how can we connect what's happening in America back to what's happening around the globe? That's what Francis Asbury saw, and that action we're going to learn more about in our polity section is still happening today. And one thing that I think is important, that as this movement grows and as it grew in America, one of the things we miss out on and we skip over, we don't think about, we don't recognize within our own Methodist heritage, is the fact that our Methodist heritage is rooted in a charismatic movement. In 1794, camp meetings began happening in North Carolina from the Methodists. Thinking about John Wesley and sort of his true conversion experiences, his moment of assurance came from a charismatic moment where he felt his heart strangely warmed. And so it's wild to think that Methodists today would be part of a camp meeting. That seems absolutely outrageous, doesn't it? Because we're now today sort of known as some of the least charismatic churches when it comes to worship and things of that nature, but we're founded in this stuff. And I think we can point back to Wesley's upbringing and Wesley's theology, where we can see two sides of the same coin here, where we have complete methodical organization and administration, and also some really true charismatic type experiential Christianity here. And think back further than that to Wesley's upbringing. What did that look like? A puritanical father and a progressive dissenting mother. Do you see that? Two sides of the same coin. And so this carries on into today, and it's one of my favorite things about our Methodist theology and our Methodist heritage. So this camp meeting movement started, and this is really one of the ways that the church began to blow up in the United States, as we took sort of the field preaching approach of Wesley and brought it to the United States. That began in North Carolina. These were revivals that were happening. Might be hard for us to imagine, but that's the way that the Methodist Church began to evangelize in the 18th century. By 1800, the Methodist Episcopal Church allows for the ordination of African Americans who would have been serving African churches, and they would have been happening on a pastoral level. Because as you know, in the 1800s in America, we see quite the dissension in our country. And by the 1840s, the Methodist Episcopal Church South is founded. This is infighting within the Methodist Church about slavery. So the Methodist Episcopal Church South secedes from the Methodist Episcopal Church to do their own thing, because the Methodist Episcopal Church North did not think slavery was appropriate. The South wanted to hold on to it, and they would not reunite for nearly 100 years, which we'll talk about here in a second. But as we now operate separately in the 1840s, the Methodist Church on the north side institutes their first black bishop by the name of Francis Burns in 1858. But this work was limited to Africa. So he's elected a bishop and placed in charge of just churches in Africa. So it's a movement into leadership to where now we have black leadership over black lives instead of white leadership over black lives. But his leadership was really, really segmented to the station of Africa. But in 1920, 2 black bishops were elected, not just put in a position, but elected by the church to serve the same as all the other bishops. Their names are Robert E. Jones and Matthew W. Clare Sr. These folks had the same rights, the same authorities as the other bishops in the Methodist Church. Isn't that interesting to think about? They had the same rights, privileges, and authorities as their white counterparts within the Methodist Church, and yet within the country they lived did not have the same rights as the people around them. And can you imagine being the churches and being the pastors in this type of culture that now had African American leadership over you? Pretty forward thinking from the Methodists. It doesn't seem very progressive to us. In fact, we read it by the 1920s that this happened, and it's kind of sad, right? It feels kind of sad that we weren't doing better. And yet, when compared to things that were happening around the globe and around and particularly in the United States, the Methodist Church was actually fairly progressive on this issue. In the late 1800s, moving backward, the church begins ordaining women, but they had all kinds of stipulations depending on their circumstance, and usually it was for one particular job or in one particular church that women would be ordained. In the 1920s, they began ordaining women as local-only ministers. They could only be within their context to consider the ordination real. We're putting all sorts of parameters around this, but full ordination of women came, but not until 1956. And we recently had some celebrations of this over the last, every handful of decades when we celebrate another sort of 10 years of the anniversary of the full inclusion of women in ministry in the Methodist Church. And so moving into 1968, over the course of the next 20 or 30 years of what we're talking about, the Methodist Episcopal Church South and the Methodist Episcopal Church North reconvene. They get back together to become the Methodist Church. And the Methodist Church merges with the Evangelical United Brethren in 1968, and that became the United Methodist Church. So we get our name from the Methodist Church merging with the Evangelical United Brethren in 1968 to become the UMC. And of course, I missed a lot of stuff, and this only brings us to 1968, but the point of this time together is to discover where our heritage came from, how we became the United Methodist Church, and so we've done that. And so when we start to talk about our organization, some stuff is going to bring us back to, well, where did the organization come from? We can point back to some of the stuff in this lesson, but we'll be looking toward modern day and other lessons. This simply brings us to our time of United Methodist history. I would love if you wanted to ask some questions, let me know some thoughts. I'll put my email on the screen here so you can take advantage of that. And feel free to drop a comment if you've got questions, or if there's something that you learned or appreciated from this, let me know. We'll be doing this Wednesdays at 6:30 at our church in October of 2023. So we've got 3 more Wednesdays to go. We hope you'll join us for that. And then we'll be recording these and get them online kind of whenever we can throughout the course of that month. We're so glad you're with us, and we'll hope you continue to do so, whether you're online or come join us in person.